Welcome to the Deakin Alumni and Deakin Business School webinar. Thanks to everyone joining us today. My name is Farisha Rahman and I work with the Deakin Alumni Relations team here in Burwood in Melbourne. Today we're delighted to have Professor Reid talking to us about home ownership trends. Professor Reid is Chair of Property and Real Estate at Deakin University, where he has been the discipline leader for the Property and Real Estate program since 2007. He is internationally recognised and has published extensively on housing, as well as being sole chief investigator for an ARC Discovery grant. He is also the editor of the International Journal of Housing Market and Analysis and a registered property valuer in New South Wales, Queensland and Victoria. So before I pass over to you, Richard, let's do a quick poll question with our audience today. So are you currently a homeowner, a renter, an investor, or do you fall in the other category? So as we can see, we've got 60% of our audience today, which is a homeowner. That's good news. Okay. So I'll switch over to you now, Richard.
So it's a pleasure to be here. As per the introduction, my background is very much in property valuation. So my comments and what I'll speak about is a mix of real-world property valuation, my experience, but also theoretical from a university perspective. This is probably one of the largest topics there is, and if you look at the recent discussion even by the current Prime Minister, there's a lot of debate on home ownership. So it's something that will be ongoing. If you've got children or grandchildren, as I do, it is something which is critical. If you're ever going to retire from your job and stop working, again, it's critical. So let's have a look at home ownership trends. Just one note, what I would suggest we do is we'll keep questions to the end. We're very keen for the discussion and your feedback, especially knowing that you are located all over the country and there's a diverse range of tenure types. So let's start with some of the topics I'd like to cover on home ownership trends. So the first one is population trends, and this is critical to home ownership. So if I start with this photograph, now this photograph is of a ghost town. So I just want you to think for a moment where home ownership starts. So home ownership starts with industry and where people live. And again, you'll see in the current debate a lot of discussion from the opposition leader and the Prime Minister about jobs. So people will live close to jobs. If you have an industry, it will attract home ownership. If you think of ghost towns, and they're always fascinating to visit, and there's quite a number in Australia, for example, of where industry used to be, especially gold mines, there's empty houses. So industry is a key point in attracting home ownership. And there's even some towns I can think of where you can actually be given a free house. So you could live there for free as long as you pay rates. So home ownership is very important as long as there's industry. And that's the starting point, is when we look at population and home ownership. So let's then move on to population per se. So this graph here shows you two things. So firstly, we have the world urban population. And again, we'll focus on urban here rather than rural in this discussion. So what you'll see at the moment, there is about 4 billion is the current world population. Australia today is sitting on a touch over 24 million. So we're absolutely tiny in the big scale. If we go forward 35 years, you'll see here a 50% increase in population. So we're up over 6 billion. And the big question for everyone with home ownership is, where are these new arrivals going to live? Where will they sleep every night, given that everyone needs about 8 hours sleep? Now this also will start us on another trajectory, which is looking at traffic congestion and the big discussion about out versus up. Should we go up in the middle of the cities, which isn't quite the Australian dream, or should we go out to the suburbs? And even sitting in Melbourne here, there was a news article last night saying that the congestion on the roads on Saturday is worse than during the week. So we have to make room for another 2 billion people in the urban areas, and have a look there at the OECD population is fairly level. So a lot of this will be in the developing countries, and for there I'm thinking of India and China as well. And here we have the rural population and the OECD rule. So that's the point. Now, just also to note that Australia is also one of the most urbanised countries in the planet. 90% of the population live in towns or cities, and again, the far majority lives on the outskirts of the country. We all live near the ocean, except for Canberra, of course, which was a man-made city. Otherwise, you'll see the majority of the population lives next to water. So, just looking at some stats to look at the framework, Australia's fertility rate is 1.88, and again, this will feed into the demand for property and home ownership. So, to keep fertility rates level, we need 2.1. So we need one person each per female to replace the existing persons, and 0.1 for to replace those that pass away due to disease and earlier. So we're below that. Okay, Italy is 1.3. Some of the other countries also are quite low, but we're certainly well below the world average. Hence, hearing about the baby bonus and the old go forth and multiply. So the median age of the population we have is 37 years. And again, this is going to feed into home ownership when we look at affordability. So only 22 years ago, it was, 32 years ago, it was, what was it, 7 years less. So we're becoming older. The median age is becoming older, and that's going to affect our retirement age. And it's also going to affect when we can borrow for home ownership. This is quite important. The life expectancy now is about 80 years for males and 84 for females. Now, if you look at the accessibility to the pension is at 67, that means you have, for the average male, an extra 13, 14 years after retirement. And for a female, of course, it's much more. It's hitting up towards 18, 19 years, where you finish work and you have to be able to live in a home, most often your own home. Now, we'll touch on this again, but home ownership in retirement is assumed. So I know in the poll earlier we said that 60% were homeowners and 24% were renters. When you retire, all of the superannuation calculations assume that you own your house. So your superannuation should spend zero on mortgage repayments or rent. It's 100% assumed home ownership. Not many people realise that. Now, the working age population is roughly about 2/3 of our total population, but the ratio is about 50%. So only about 50% of Australians are aged between 15 to 64. So about half of the population is working, the other half isn't. And this also chimes into why they were trying to extend the working age or access to the pension to 67. Now also just note here that the prediction for 2056 is that 1 in 4 people will be aged over 65. So this is quite a large statistic. So again, assuming home ownership, that we must have at least 25% own their own home. And this is something which isn't very much talked about. In a moment, we'll also talk about immigration and home ownership. So not that long ago, 22 years ago, it was about 12%. By 2056, 100% increase to 25%. It's quite a large, what we call grey power. Now, another change has been that 74% of family households are families, 23% are lone person households. Now, when we look at buying a house and home ownership, 23% go and try and buy a house on one income. The ABS predicts that by 2030, that's going to hit 30%. So almost 1 in 3 households will be a single income household that is competing in the same market for home ownership as a family household, especially DINKs, dual income, no kids incomes. So housing is one of those rare markets where, say you went to an auction, you might have on one side of you an investor trying to buy, you might have a single person household, and then you might have a dual person household. They're all competing in the same market for exactly the same product and the same key to the door. How do we level the playing field for those that want home ownership? One of the solutions might be down the bottom there being group households. So you might see that at the moment 3% were group households. There is some innovative approaches that can we combine some lone households? Why does every lone or single person household need their own kitchen, their own toilet, their own bathroom? Can we have some innovative approaches where they can actually share a house? And you've seen some of those, the way houses have been designed over the years with a duplex, two lots with a shared wall. Can we do that with group households? 40% of families have both couples employed. And again, when we're looking at buying a house, that's a huge benefit. A bank or a financier purely looks at the combined household income. So when we talk about buying a house, we look at households. We don't look at single person. So if you go to the bank, what the bank will look at is they'll look at the gross income of the household. So the two couples, they'll look at committing 40% of that to a house. So that house with a couple will have a much greater affordability than a single person household, which we said will go to 30%, or as noted there, 10% of children live in a family with no employment. So they're on welfare, for example. Now, where I'm leading you to is we're getting towards a society with home ownership of haves and have-nots, and that there is a big divide that is opening. There's either those that are in home ownership, there's getting towards a Grand Canyon, and there's those that aren't. And this isn't talked about very much, but it's becoming clearer when we start to look at these sorts of statistics. Net overseas migration is 240,000 migrants per annum. So there's been a misconception that immigration is bad, they're competing for us with home ownership. But as you'll see in a moment, a lot of those migrants are also investors, and they're providing rental accommodation for those that choose not to become a homeowner. So let's look a bit more closely. So here we have, if we look at population, this is our standard projection. So population projections are great because we know where we're going. Looking at what we're doing, you'll see that by 2023, that's where we'll be. Now note again, over 65, all of these people here assumed home ownership. So home ownership looks both at those trying to get into the market, newly formed households, and also retaining home ownership here. Okay, so that's where we're likely to be heading. And we've got a 200% increase in over hundreds. If we change this slightly and we go forward, have a look there at, again, the aging of population, advances in medicine. Look at the 1 in 4, which now must have home ownership. So if you're down here and you're renting, somehow you need to get into home ownership here. And I know this is a time when children are often born and there's higher pressures. It's critical to enter home ownership here because the government clearly is going to keep pushing out the pension age. So this is, I guess, one point to note is home ownership is a personal decision, but if you're renting now, it's important to not rent as you age. Now, just the other question I get quite often is, what about immigrants? Why do they compete with us? Do we need immigration? Have a look at this graph here from the ABS. If we don't have immigration, what you'll see is, again, families aren't, we're not producing families like we were. And you'll see a graph on fertility in a moment. We need immigration to increase the working population here, to pay tax. Every worker is a tax payer as well. And again, the government clearly knows this, as all economists do. So how are these people here, between 15 to 64, going to fund this ageing population? And again, you'll see a huge gap, a huge difference between that graph, so that includes immigrants, that graph there is no immigrants. So we need immigrants, and we actively pursue them and compete for them like other countries. So just remember those two graphs there. If we look here at the fertility rate, this is one of the problems that we have, is that when I grew up, the family across the road had 6 children, and that was normal. If you look here, what happened with the baby boom, people came back from the war, prosperous, and go forth and multiply, and you'll see a baby boom echo is what we found here. Since then, we've really declined in fertility rates. So we've had, it's quite common now to have no children or a one-child family. Previously, the norm would have been 3 or 4 children. So this really drives the type of house we need. Now, one of the things that is alarming in Australian home ownership is we have the largest houses in the country. So the average house area of a new house is 264 square metres. So if you go to the outskirts of the major capital cities, you'll see the McMansions. They're huge. They have 4-bedroom houses, 4 bedrooms, media room, lounge, dining, given a smaller backyard, but they're 2-storey ginormous. This is at the same time when we've got small families, and often the argument is that we don't want our children to share the same bedroom. Well, our foreparents, our grandparents, lived in smaller houses, 2-bedroom houses, with much larger families, but somehow we sort of lost sight. And again, it could be a social pressure. That my argument would be that we need to go back, and we don't necessarily need a brand new large house from day one. We need to get on the housing ladder. There's no argument we have a smaller family now. So even a 1-bedroom unit for a couple, there's a lot of resistance in the marketplace. But from my perspective, that's much better getting into home ownership that way than renting. And if our grandparents could do it, and we're obviously all here, and then they could move into a larger house, there seems to be a total mismatch between larger houses and smaller families. And the option is renting rather than move into a smaller house. So let's look at some home ownership trends. So what is happening now? Here is some international home ownership rates. So this country is sitting around about 70%, which is common in Western civilizations. You'll see the UK is around about 70, the US as well. Spain is markedly higher, and Ireland and so forth. What you'll note down here is Germany is down to 41%. So I spend a lot of time in Germany, and it's quite common to rent. So most of the renting is from home ownership government bodies. So the government owns the property, and I just rent for life. Okay. One other thing to note is that Germany also has a shrinking population, so it's decreasing in their residents. So home ownership, in my mind, can also be linked to stability and a sense of place. But so we used to be higher, and I'll show you the graph in a moment. We're certainly decreasing. But if you have been to some of these other countries, you'll see some of the taxation and economic incentives for home ownership. So what's happening at home? So here we have, again, used to be around about 70%, a nudge over 70%. And even in the 5 years between 2006 and 2011, it's dropped. Why is that? It's dropped between owned outright in those years. and also it's a slight increase with owned by a mortgage. Okay, there's a number of reasons for that. My observations are there's a lot of people now deciding to rent rather than buy, and also it's been socially acceptable now to rent. Previously it would be, oh you poor thing, when are you going to buy? But now you're able to access a lot more benefits through renting, and I'll touch on those in a moment. But as every day goes past, there's fewer and fewer people entering home ownership. And again, the government is trying very hard to rectify this, but in my mind, it still hasn't reversed the problem. I know quite a few property people that, for example, rent, and that they're quite happy to rent, and they'll tell you, look, I'm renting, why should I buy? I can put my money elsewhere and I don't have the risk that's involved with renting. So let's come to that. Part of my talk here actually is just trying to inspire you and to raise some of the issues that we have. Now if we drill down a bit more and look at it state by state, you'll see again a nationwide decrease in over those 5 years. Interestingly, you'll see Tasmania has one of the highest ownership rates, and I'd argue that's because of affordability issues. I know quite a few people myself who have a holiday home, for example, in Tasmania. You'll see again that was a few years ago. I'd argue that affordability or home ownership has dropped in New South Wales, and I think you'll find that will also happen in Queensland. It surprises me, in Victoria, it surprises me that Queensland is so low and there's a market gap there. But looking at that market, I can't think of any incentives for the government to increase home ownership. So looking at who is buying and who is owning what. So again, these figures here are aggregated, which are always quite dangerous. So if we look down now at not by state, we look at who and what. And property can be segmented into different markets. So again, this data is a little bit confusing. I'll look now at percentages. So the same data, just drill down. Now, if we look at the occupied private dwellings, roughly 67%. So in 2011, we had outright ownership. Okay, so we have somewhere around about 32% own outright, and about 35% have a mortgage. But just for a moment, think of the RBA decreasing home lending rates. It actually only affects 35% of homeowners, doesn't it? These people here are not affected. So they talk about there's a massive saving for mortgages. It only affects about a third of homeowners, which is certainly not 100%. And we have about 30% rented outright, and you'll see a very, very small percentage in occupied private dwellings. Now just looking down at housing, housing is where the Great Australian Dream. So we have about 36% owned outright. So I'll compare in a moment to apartments and townhouses. About 40% are purchased by a mortgage. So about 36% are owned outright, 40% by a mortgage. So overall it's about 75%, 76%. So much higher for housing. Where I think some of the attention needs to go, and you can see there's almost 6 million houses. We have getting towards 1 million of detached. So we only have 23% if I look at home ownership here. And even apartments is down to 15%. So very low home ownership in apartments, even though it's looking somewhere around about 1 in 5, 1 in 6 compared to houses. 17% with the mortgage. We have rental-wise in apartments, 62%. And in my mind, this is the future, or the growth market will be in apartments. So this very much is an investment area. This is very much where we talk about GST as well. So when we talk about home ownership, this is the area which is really growing. And this is where it's happening, is private renters and total renters are increasing. We've gone from somewhere here around about 28%, now around about to 32%. But every one more renter is one less homeowner, which is a difference of 2. So, so that the tide is certainly shifting quite fast. So, looking at housing affordability here. So, this is something which has been touched in the media, but again, I see it as a huge barrier. In other words, why would you buy a house? So, severely affordable is over 5.1. If you just keep that in mind for a moment. Here's a graph of the most and the least affordable markets from last year. Now, Hong Kong is the highest. Now, Hong Kong has the largest density, or the highest density in the world, and I'd argue that's driven purely by supply and demand. Gold is very expensive because it's in limited supply, and that's the same economic argument I'd have here. But have a look at Sydney. It's the second highest in the world. And we said 5.1 was very unaffordable. It's nudged 12. Now again, this is 2015, and we know prices have gone even higher. 2016, if you look at Melbourne in 2015, it's almost double severely unaffordable. And then some of the other markets. Again, this is calculated by the house price divided by the median household income. Imagine markets where we have a single household income, which again I said was nudging up towards 30% by 2030. How are they ever going to enter the marketplace? And then national, if we look at it at the national country level, Australia there is over 5.1. It's certainly levelled out a bit by states such as Tasmania and the rural areas. Hong Kong is an outlier, but we're certainly the highest of the developed area. Even look at the US is certainly affordable, just a nudge over 3. But we're certainly off the scales. And if you've ever thought, how can I ever afford to get into the housing market? It's fairly black and white, or blue and white. And this is one of the problems, is what's happened. So the 2 things to note here, real house prices in the country have gone up quite sharply. So this is how much it costs to buy a house. This is the real household income trend. Now, income is linked very much to Consumer Price Index, or CPI. Now, we have very, very low, or relatively low CPI at the moment. Our wages do not go up very much because we've kept CPI down, but at the same time, the price of housing is gone through the roof. Now, again, I guess the point I'd like to make here is you need to jump into the housing market, and there's a huge gap in between how much you can afford and the price of housing. So does this mean home ownership? You'll get people moving out of Sydney and Melbourne, but there's no dispute. When you go, there's no debate. When you walk into a bank or a financier, they're going to ask you a question: what is your household income? And also your ability to save a deposit. There's no shortcuts there, but the gap is huge. So looking here at households, that's 2006, increases in rental stress, 2025. Have a look at private owners, private renters is through the roof. So short term, my argument is that yes, it's cheaper to rent. Long term, there will be pain felt, especially as you enter superannuation and retirement. It's going to hurt. So short-term gain, long-term pain. Once you climb on that housing ladder, the owners won't feel the stress. And even on this graph here, the impact of a 10% increase on disposable income. So even if you were given a 10% increase in income for your household, will you be able to become a homeowner? It's still not going to help Australian households that much. It'll help a little bit, but certainly not as much as the other countries. Why? Personally, I think the gap is too wide, and also we've been losing the drive to enter home ownership at all costs. And again, our predecessors used to make lots of sacrifices. They never used to have the extra demands on disposable income, such as mobile phones, the need to travel overseas, eating out, all of those extra things we have, the new car, the new home. The gap now is large and growing. I just want to look at some standard graphs, some economics here. Now, the price of housing is driven very much by demand. So if demand drops, quantity increases, the price will go down. And there's been a lot of discussion about negative gearing and about investment from overseas investors. So housing works very much like that. It's supply and demand. Buy a property which will have increased demand and limited supply. One of the big debates is about if we just increase supply on the supply curve, the price will decrease. If we have limited supply, the price will increase. And again, gold is a good example there. I don't see that as the be-all and end-all solution, just constantly increasing supply. And again, you'll see much of the demand isn't for living in the inner cities, it's for living in the outskirts. So it's having your cake and eating it too. And even I notice here in Melbourne, the amount of road rage that I witness and people wanting to live further out with the house, but travelling 2 hours each way. Something will give soon, and it could be this perception that living closer in and living in a condo or a unit is acceptable. One of the things, a recent debate has been here, so this is a standard supply and demand graph, and we talk a lot about equilibrium here. The price of a house or property is somewhere in between here. I think there could be some virtue in this argument that somewhere in the city or any city, there are quite a few vacant or for sale properties, but there's an enormous amount of vacant properties. So if we did want to lower the cost of housing, if you conducted a door knock, and there was a recent study looking at the water usage, there's a large number of properties, thousands in every city, which are vacant with fresh air. So how do we use these cities more efficiently? I was at a seminar recently, and there was a discussion about we should force people who live in a house and don't use all their bedrooms to downsize. I don't believe in that, but I believe there should be a huge incentive. If you've got some empty nesters where the children have left, why should the people downsize? So to downsize and move is a huge cost for stamp duty and then buying another house and so forth. So I believe there should be a huge encouragement, say, for example, similar to when you drive down a freeway and you've got a 2 and over person in the fast lane. We really need to make better use of all these vacant properties that you and I drive past every day on the way to work. In the city, a commercial property, there's an enormous amount of empty large buildings, but we're not very efficient. So maybe we need to have the mindset that if you know an older person, maybe they could downsize and it's more sustainable, or it's cheaper for everyone. And I think of all the people driving to and from work and the morning traffic jams past empty houses. And also here we have increased demand for houses. Do we all need to live in a big house? Can we live in units? Can we live in a city? Do we need to live on the outskirts in a new house? And that's something else that might be a mindset. And then the other one is a shift in demand for housing either in or out. And again, there's an argument that if we have smaller families, do we need 264 square metre houses? And do we need a new house? Again, reusing things. Can we buy an older house as our first house? Do we need to borrow? And I lose a lot of sleep of people borrowing at low rates, and then I fondly remember interest rates at 18% in the late 80s, and receiving a letter saying interest rate is now 15%, 16%, 17% or 18%. So if you borrow at 5% and the interest rate goes up to 5.5%, that's a 10% increase in your mortgage repayments. So think about the relative repayments. For a homeowner, it's important not always to borrow to the max. So rent versus buy, and this is a topic which I think is affecting home ownership immensely. Now, this is talking here to the investors, and I saw that there's 7% online. What's happened is you'll see here, a decision comes at some point in time is, will I buy or will I rent? And renting, clearly, you can actually rent a much better property than you can buy. Even if you thought of renting a car, I know you can often rent a better car than you can buy. There's no in and out costs. You'd rent for 12 months. There's no stamp duty. Different to other countries, the owner pays the rates. The owner actually pays the maintenance, and often they pay the owner's corp and the water. So renting is far, far cheaper. So why would you ever buy? One of the arguments against renting, you'll see here that the weekly rental rate is going up. You've actually got no say on what the rent will be. And if you've ever been in a market where the rental market's hot, you'll be going and signing a rental lease for a property sight unseen. You've got a higher risk and less what we call tenure. So the downside about this is there. From an investor's point of view, the yields are just mind-blowingly low. So you would buy a property and the yields I see in most capital cities. So if you buy an investment property for $1 million, your yield of 4% is $40,000 you'll get back, gross. And you have to take out 8% for property management, rates, owner's corp, and so you're actually getting, say, a 2% return on your investment. All of the betting or your risk is looking at, is there going to be capital growth? And I'm always stunned by how, if you went into the share market and tried to buy something with a 2% return and no guaranteed capital growth, it would be quite risky. So if we look just closer now at Melbourne, for example, Melbourne's even more surprising for me. And you'll see the gross yields. Again, someone will buy a property, $1 million property, it will rent for 3% or roughly $35,000. So it will rent for $700 a week. So if I wanted to buy that property, I would have to borrow at 5% or higher and pay the deposit, but I would be paying in repayment something $50,000 plus maintenance, plus rates, plus owner's corp. So I would be paying something around about $75,000, $80,000 a year in repayments and costs, but I can rent it for only 3.2%, $35,000. So why wouldn't I rent? I think this is quite a risky scenario we've set up at the moment, because rents clearly are going to adjust. Why would you borrow at this amount? So here's the Commonwealth Bank lending rate at the moment. So there's no way you can borrow for much less than this. So you're borrowing for 5.3% is fixed, or say 5%. But rent-wise, gross, you're only getting back 3.2. So in the future, I can see rents skyrocketing when they catch up. So at the moment, the market's slightly oversupplied with investment properties. Once that tightens, I can see rents doubling, tripling. Why not? Well, people need to stay somewhere. So again, this is a false sense of security I see for renters. This just will not last. The investor is hoping on negative gearing, and as we all know, it's been in the press a lot lately, and I can't see that lasting forever. I know too many people who are negative gearing. Right, so addressing declining home ownership. So just some points we will finish on, and then we'll open to questions. So the cost of home ownership competes with other income pressures and norms. So one thing I've noticed is home ownership used to be the be-all and end-all. When are you buying a house? Now it's dropped down. It's behind, it's dropped underneath travelling overseas, the OE, overseas experience. It's dropped behind the big screen TV, a new car, eating out, all of those sorts of things. Home ownership now is well down the list, and I can see that many families and households have actually given up. Why? How can I save $100,000 cash to walk in? Why bother? I don't need a deposit for renting. So that's one problem. One thing I'd like to support is that home ownership offers a sense of place. And if you think of your parents and grandparents, they stayed in the same home for a generation. Now, there's a huge market for storage and moving companies. So people move all the time and relocate. We're moving into psychology here and social analysis, but home ownership and living in a home is something where your family would grow up. So I think that's quite important but underestimated. Retirement assumes home ownership. Now, nobody ever talks about that. So if you jump onto any website, how much do I need to retire, it assumes you're not paying rent or mortgage repayments. So if you're 30, 35 or 40, you've got 27 years to pay it off and to have the title in your hand. If you can't do that, you'll need a lot more super. And again, that's a hidden twist, I think, or bite in the tail that's going to hurt a lot of people. You can access funds without moving. So it is possible to have home ownership, and there's a thing called reverse mortgages that many organisations, including a bank, the Commonwealth Bank, offer. So you can actually get into home ownership, and if you need some money when you retire, you can pull it out for what they call age in place. And that doesn't have a large profile. And again, ageing in place is promoted for seniors, and I think home ownership, there'd be renting and moving when you're an older person, getting told to vacate. Personally, I think would be quite tough. I know my grandparents stayed and they aged in place. I think we're going to see the next generation moving around. It's a very inefficient market for use, and I've touched on that we don't have a very inefficient market, but we probably need to get the mindset that if our car is too big, it will downsize to a Corolla. If our house is too big, maybe we'll move in closer. But there are a lot of rooms where the door is shut, and maybe we'll get visitors. But I think that's being sacrificed for a younger household who are moved and pushed further out in the traffic jams. And I touched on there's a ridiculous inverse relationship between area and household size. So as the area has gone up, because that's what you do with the Joneses, and I've got, size matters, household size has dropped. Do we need a 4-bedroom house with no children or a token child? So I think a 2-bedroom house is fine. And finally, I think a long-term perspective is needed. The 9/11 approach, which is live for today, you never know what's going to happen tomorrow. I can see that, but I think we need to look at longevity. And I started with the median age, 80 odd for males, 84 for females. That's what we're all going to live towards. Certainly, the 9/11, who knows, will be here tomorrow. Most likely, you will. And population can work out very nicely, and it's very reliable. This is how old you will be. So my suggestion would be to map out how old you'll be when you'll achieve home ownership, not if. And then it would be quite nice to retire and not have to pay a mortgage or rent. So that draws me to a close. What we'll do now with Farisha is open up to questions. I've tried to inspire you a little bit conjecture, and let's see what the questions are.
Yes, thank you very much, Richard. That was a wonderful presentation and some very interesting statistics. So we'll now go on to the question time. And I think I'll just stop the webcam for now. So let's begin with our first question from Dorianne. Are the Australian towns where homes are provided for free to encourage families to live in these areas easily found?
Yeah, I think so, but I think the big question is going to be, and I often think of this, if you think of the best location you could think of in this country, so you might want to live on the tip of Cape York, so you go and build a house there. The first thing you're going to need is electricity, you're going to need services, if you've got a family you'll need schools, you'll need a whole bundle of services. So you can live in a location, and what the local governments are trying to do is encourage a group of people to come, and then after that there'll be the school, there'll be the police station, the shops, the IGA and so forth. And if you've ever played SimCity or those sorts of games, that's what you're trying to do. The challenge is to why do people live there? And again, it's mainly because of industry. There's a hot debate at the moment in what to do with mining towns after they've left. So I think it is possible to find those towns. If you Google, you can see they're often in the newspaper, free house. I remember in Tasmania last year you could buy the whole town. But the big question is going to be, if you go to realestate.com or Real Estate View or Domain, just Google in the cheapest property, try and buy the cheapest house, and you'll find one for $20,000, which is fine, but would you actually live there, and for how long?
Thanks, Richard. Let's go to our next question now. How should renters get into the market? Hard to save while paying rent, and more for young people living at home for longer. Is that the only answer? Sorry. If you buy, you often end up paying mortgages for 25 to 30 years and subject to interest rates changing, etc. in that time.
Okay, that's probably the hot question. How do renters get into the market? I think it's all income and expenses. So the first thing you need to do is buy assets which appreciate in value. So, you know, if you look at Harvey Norman shares, they've gone through the roof. And every time there's a handout from the government, people go and buy depreciating goods. And the word frugal. So I think what you need to do is to save money. And when I went through school, we'd have a Dolomites accounts or the elephant from Commonwealth Bank. I think the saving mentality has almost disappeared, and I don't actually know if they do that at school. So I think using the compounding interest amount is saving money. You'll be amazed how quickly putting money in a saving account or one of those Christmas accounts. And I was always taught to save 10% of your income. And I believe if you save 10%, you'll be fine. So one side is saving money and putting it aside. The other one, I would suggest, and you've touched on it, is saving costs. So returning to the nest or staying at home. I was one of those people that left home as soon as I could at 19. But nowadays it's quite common to stay at home until your mid-20s and save money. I mean, it's tax-free. You don't need to go out and pay rates and all of those sorts of things. So I would suggest staying at home as much as possible. The big elephant in the room, I guess, is having your parents. And I know a lot of people where their parents will pay the deposit or at least go guarantor. Increasingly, I think we're in a market where you need help. I'm not really convinced somebody can finish uni and then go and get a job, save a deposit, and compete in the marketplace. So I think you do need some help more and more. I think one of the things, and this comes down to a personal decision, I wouldn't mind going as a mortgagee or for my children. However, I draw the line at paying the deposit. But I do know a lot of people that will pay the deposit. All I think is happening is the market's being inflated. But unfortunately, if you go to buy a property, you're actually competing with an investor. So just the final thing I'd say, I think that there needs to be some sacrifices made. So rather than going out, I've seen some university students who are on a scholarship on very minimal wage, and they're able to save thousands of dollars every year. So be amazed if you go to cheap eats or public transport or just paying for a couple of years, and then you'll be able to save that deposit. And that could also be a second job.
Thanks, Richard. That's some great tips that you've provided. Let's go on to our next question from Tom. Hi, Richard. What are your thoughts on investing in commercial property as an investment and maintain renting in residential? Do you see this as a wise option?
Okay, so typically that's a good question, Tom. Now, this is going to get into personal where and when and why. Most people invest in, if they want to buy an investment property, they would buy a house, simply because that's what they know most about, and also because it's easily rentable. And a lot of people need to buy a house now, or need to sleep somewhere. So there's a lot of demand for housing. However, property investment comes down to risk reward. So the lower the risk, the lower the reward. Normally the traditional model is after you have a portfolio of houses and or units, say up to 5 or 10, you would then diversify into commercial or industrial property, which is a higher risk but a higher return. The problem that you have is with a commercial property, there's only a few people that would want to rent it. So if you look at Dick Smith closing, all of those properties now are vacant. The big problem, if we look at it from an investment point of view, and I've felt this myself, is the tenant moves out, be it residential or commercial, the bank will still put its hand out needing that money. So you actually need cash flow. So how are you going to pay the bank all those months until you find a tenant? And commercial tenants typically are longer, 3, 5 to 10 years, but you might have a vacancy of a year. So how do you fund that cash flow? That's probably the biggest question.
Thanks, Richard. We'll move on to our next question from Joshua. Would you recommend buying in a low social economic area with low growth rates to get into the market?
Again, that's another good question. It really depends on affordability. What all property people are trying to be is visionaries. So they're trying to look forward and where is the next market going to be? And they're trying to get there before someone says it's taken off. And as we know with share investment, if you invest in the share market, by the time you've hopped onto a stock that's taken off, such as Apple last night, the big end of town's already there. It's gone. So the advantage of the lower socioeconomic suburbs is often they are suburbs which used to be industrial and they will take off. Now, one example I'll use if you're in Melbourne would be Frankston, for example. Now, Frankston used to be a lower socio-economic suburb, but more recently it's taken off. And what will happen over time is as it takes off, a suburb, the values increase. As the values and the rents increase, the rates increase, and the lower socio-economic households actually get forced out. Then it becomes a higher one. So what you're able to do is look at a city, and if you see an industry typically moving out or changing, that would be an area to cotton onto. And that's something I would suggest is just trying to predict forward. I remember here in Melbourne, one year not so long ago, Port Melbourne went up 89% one year. But there's other cities and there's suburbs in other cities which typically have gone through gentrification. Homebush in Sydney was one clearly helped by the Olympics. But certainly things are more affordable, and over time they will increase. I guess the trick there is to have a long-term perspective. You don't really want to go in and out. You really want to go in, stay there, and over time you'll see an increase in demographics. And my research and my PhD is very much in demographics drive home ownership. And then in a higher socioeconomic area or higher house prices, you'll see the more educated, higher income folk. But they do move around. So as you get older, you'll see suburbs change in value. The trick is just to put your thinking cap on and work out, this suburb's changing, now's a good time to get in.
Thanks, Richard. We've got quite a lot of questions coming through, so we'll try to answer a couple more. Question from Krunal. Your stats show that there's lots of vacant property in the CBD, but lots of apartments in Melbourne are still building up. Why is this happening, and how can I make a decision to buy an investment property with land or near the CBD?
Okay, yeah, there is. Actually, I touched on commercial property in Melbourne, and the City of Melbourne do a survey called CLUE, Census of Land Use and Employment, and they survey all the commercial buildings, and I was amazed at how many of those just have vacant floors. So we look at residential. I think one of the issues has been overseas investors, and I was in China last week and looking at one of the questions was about Chinese investment, and the property, especially in the cities, the apartments, is sold to overseas investors. So, and a lot of those apartments are vacant. And so one of the things I would do, I'd be wary of anywhere which says rental guarantee for 2 years, because you're actually paying for that. So really, how do you know which ones are vacant? You really don't. I think there was an analysis. I know myself, you can look at a building and work out how many lights are on. There's also a question of civil liberties. I mean, all of us probably own a car. How often do you use that car? Should you use it more or less? So you can't really force people to use property. My belief is that there's a lot of property that's paid cash, especially from overseas investors. So they're not really in a hurry to purchase. So you can't really examine the market that closely by looking at, will this cause a glut? Just in closing on this question, my other argument would be if you want a long-term increase in value, apartments give great yields, so high returns but very low long-term gain. If you buy anywhere with a land component or a house, it will give you a higher long-term return because it's limited supply, but it'll give you a low rent or low yield. So it really depends on whether you want cash in hand or longer term.
Thanks, Richard. I think we'll answer our last question now. What do you think of buying now for retirement rather than for a family home than downsizing? We recently sold our family home and have considered buying an apartment with the view to live in later in life and continue renting while the kids are growing up because the bigger homes are so expensive.
Okay, one of the things about home ownership is it's one of the rare, or maybe one of the last, tax-free havens. So it's completely exempt from capital gains tax. So as long as you don't buy and sell in more than 6 months, if you buy a property and then sell it, any gain is tax-free. So that's something that I would advocate you could look at doing. I'm not quite sure where you're located or what you're looking at there. Probably what I'd suggest doing is, and not many households are good at this, is looking ahead the next 5, 10 to 20 years and working out an investment plan. I see a lot of families are caught up on a day-to-day, this is where we're living. What do we need from a housing perspective? And also don't be afraid to move closer into the inner city. I mean, personally, I live towards the inner city, and it's a lifestyle choice, but you don't get caught up in the car on the weekend, and it's a lot more livable. So livability and especially walkability has also become quite important, especially as you get older and not living in stairs and so forth.
Thank you very much, Richard. I think that's all we have time for today. Richard's been really nice to share his contact details with us, so you can tweet to him at Dr. Richard Reid or email him at richard.reid@deakin.edu.au as displayed on the screen. Thanks again, Richard, for presenting with us today, and a big thank you to our audience for participating and all your questions today.